Welcome to our channel Hollywood Movie Review. Nuremberg 2025 Movie Review. Nuremberg is a 2025 American psychological thriller historical drama film written, co-produced and directed by James Vanderbilt, based on the 2013 book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist by Jack L. High. The film follows U.S. Army psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, seeking to investigate the personalities and monitor the mental status of Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, and other high-ranking Nazis in preparation for and during the Nuremberg trials. Leo Woodall, John Slattery, Mark O'Brien, Colin Hanks, Ren Schmidt, Lydia Peckham, Richard E. Grant, and Michael Shannon have supporting roles in the film. The film had its world premiere in the gala presentations section of the Toronto International Film Festival on September 7, 2025. It was released theatrically in the United States by Sony Pictures Classics on November 7, 2025. The film received generally positive reviews from critics, with particular praise for Crowe's performance. On May 7, 1945, one day before Nazi Germany surrenders to the Allies, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Hitler's former second-in-command, surrenders with his family to U.S. forces in Austria. At the same time, Associate Justice Robert Jackson is informed of Göring's arrest, which prompts a discussion with his secretary, Elsie Douglas, about establishing an international tribunal to charge the surviving Nazi leadership with war crimes. Douglas is conservative, noting that such potential action has no legally established international precedent. However, Jackson is enthusiastic, envisioning the tribunal as an opportunity of establishing one. Initially, the U.S. is reluctant to support Jackson's plans in favor of summary executions. However, Jackson persists by winning the support of Pope Pius XII by implying his knowledge of the latter's controversial relationship with the Nazi regime. Elsewhere, U.S. Army psychiatrist LTCOL. Douglas Kelly is summoned to Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg, to evaluate the mental health of 22 Nazi leaders under Allied custody, including Göring, who have been selected for prosecution. Reporting to the warden, COL. Burton Andrus, Kelly begins his assignment with the assistance of interpreter Sergeant Howard Trieste. Initial meetings with Göring are civil. However, other prisoners such as Robert Lay and Julius Streicher react with contempt. Personally, Kelly appraises Göring as intelligent yet highly narcissistic, and plans to use his notes of those interactions to write a tell-all book for personal profit. In due course, Jackson and British barrister Sir David Maxwell Fyfe are made prosecuting counsels for the newly established International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany, which in turn charges the detainees with crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity and conspiracy. In the lead-up to the trial, Kelly and Göring interact warmly, with Göring going so far as to helping Kelly examine former Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, in exchange for being allowed to write to his wife Emmy and daughter Etta. Kelly also develops a rapport with them, acting as a courier between them and Göring. In private, Kelly is approached by Jackson to report the prisoner's legal defense to him in order to shape the prosecution. Before the trial can commence, Lay commits suicide by strangling himself in his cell, leading Andrus to summon psychologist Gustav Gilbert to provide a second opinion. At the trial's beginning, Jackson delivers a strong opening statement highlighting the need for accountability. While Göring is silenced and instead ordered to enter a plea, he and the other prisoners plead not guilty. During adjournments, Kelly learns that Göring's family had been arrested in connection with his reported art thefts and requests Andrus to intervene. Göring later learns of the development from Gilbert. When the trial recommences, the prosecution shows footage displaying the regime's atrocities committed inside its concentration camps, causing an upset Kelly to confront Göring, who had previously denied any knowledge of such actions. Göring stands by his unawareness, and resorts towards denying the atrocities or comparing them with alleged crimes committed by the Allies. Dismayed, Kelly proceeds to get drunk and unwittingly reveals his private discussions with Göring to Lila, a journalist with the Boston Globe, who subsequently publishes the information. Infuriated, Andrus relieves Kelly and orders him out, but not before revealing that he was able to get Emmy and Etta released. While leaving, Trieste reveals to Kelly that he is a German-born Jew, and that while his younger sister was able to escape to Switzerland, His parents were murdered by the Nazis in 1942. Trieste warns that the regime's cruelty was unchallenged because of a general impassivity towards evil, which compels Kelly to stay and instead submit all his private notes on Göring to Jackson and Fife, predicting that Göring plans to use the trial to defend the regime's conduct. As Kelly predicted, Göring is able to evade Jackson's cross-examination, and proceeds to declare that his decree of the final solution was actually intended as a complete solution focused on the emigration of Germany's Jews rather than extermination. In turn, Jackson's ire towards Göring earns him a stern rebuke by the tribunal, which prompts Fife to take over. Fife exploits Göring's vanity and goads him into overtly admitting his continued loyalty to Hitler, which finally corners him. At the trial's conclusion, Göring is sentenced to death by hanging. Kelly pays Göring a final visit before leaving, where he comes to terms with Göring's true nature. On October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, Göring commits suicide by ingesting cyanide, much to Andrus' anger. The remaining executions proceed as scheduled, with Stryker suffering a nervous breakdown. Trieste, who had intended to reveal his Jewish heritage to Stryker before his execution, instead chooses to gently assist him to the gallows. The execution goes poorly, with Stryker having to be weighed down on the noose to die. Kelly, traumatized by his experiences at Nuremberg, returns to the US and publishes his tell-all, 22 Cells in Nuremberg, which he has trouble promoting. The film's intertitles reveal that Kelly resorted to alcoholism and spent the rest of his life in vain warning about the possibility of a future regime parallel to the Nazis, before committing suicide in 1958 by ingesting cyanide. Trieste managed to reunite with his sister, while Jackson's prosecutorial efforts at Nuremberg laid the foundation for international prosecution of war crimes. In December 2023, it was announced that James Vanderbilt was set to write and direct the film, with Rami Malek, Russell Crowe and Michael Shannon starring. Additional casting with Richard E. Grant, Leo Woodall, John Slattery, and Colin Hanks was announced in January and February 2024. In June 2025, Sony Pictures Classics acquired North American and worldwide airline rights to the film and scheduled a release for it in the US on November 7, 2025. The film's early special release with a Q&A session with Vanderbilt and Crowe was on October 27, 2025. At the premiere in Toronto, it received a 4-minute standing ovation, one of TIFF's longest standing ovations ever. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, 72% of 202 critics' reviews are positive, with an average rating of 6.7/10. The website's consensus reads, driven by a commanding performance from Russell Crowe, Nuremberg is a handsomely crafted historical drama, but its measured pacing and emotional restraint keep it from fully realizing the complexity of its subject. Metacritic, which uses a weighted average, assigned the film a score of 61 out of 100, based on 37 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. Matt Zoller cites of RoachRevert.com gave the film 3 out of 4 stars, writing, "It's a solid film of kind that used to be more common, an earnest, unpretentious Oscar movie that wants to be seen by everyone, and consequently doesn't try to be too complex or arty. It wants to educate and inspire as well as entertain, and isn't shy about that ambition." Writing for the Daily Beast, Nick Schrager found the film to be flawed in spite of the star actors in the film, and critiqued Vanderbilt's direction by stating, "Nuremberg is constructed like an old-fashioned awards-bait period piece, complete with trailer-ready lines of dialogue that put a neat and tidy button on scenes. There's a mechanical quality to Vanderbilt's plotting that negates the unexpected and enlightening." In a review for The Guardian, Peter Bradshaw rated the film 2 out of 5 stars, noting, "All of these actors do their best, but the figure of Kelly himself is a ridiculous cartoon." He cited Rami Malek's performance as deeply silly. Katie Walsh of the Los Angeles Times described the film as well-intentioned and elucidating despite some missteps. "There are countless variations of the saying history repeats itself. One that fits the intent of James Vanderbilt's film Nuremberg is, History continually repeats itself, but we have short attention spans. The story revisits the final days of World War II and the Nuremberg trials. The studio describes the film as the story of the psychiatrist who evaluated members of the Nazi high command before the trials. But what unfolds on screen is the story of how that psychiatrist develops an obsessive bond with Hermann Göring, a connection that ultimately leads to his undoing. The movie begins with Göring attempting to flee at the end of the war before being captured by Allied forces. We see him, along with other leading figures from Hitler's inner circle, taken into custody. Douglas Kelly, played by Rami Malek, is brought in to create psychological profiles of these men. In the background is the effort of Justice Robert Jackson, played by Michael Shannon, who believes these men must stand trial for their crimes. He argues that they should not simply be executed. There must also be a public accounting for the horrors carried out in the name of the Third Reich. This dual focus is one of the film's weaknesses. The constant shifting between the legal preparation and the personal relationship between Kelly and Göring creates a mishmash narrative. The filmmakers clearly want to tell the story of Kelly and Göring, but the movie keeps wandering away from it. Russell Crowe's Göring is charming to the point of being almost disarming. But it doesn't take long to see the evil beneath that charisma. He expresses great love for his wife and daughter, which he uses to manipulate Kelly into delivering letters to them. We watch the two men talk and probe one another. Kelly is writing a book about what he is learning from Göring and the others. His questions cut to the heart of how such atrocities came to be. When Kelly asks why he followed Hitler, Göring describes a devastated Germany after World War I, a nation humiliated and made to suffer. Hitler told them that foreign powers were feasting on their pain and promised that Germany could reclaim its former glory. He made them feel proud again. Kelly's obsession with Göring becomes his downfall, costing him his position, but not before Göring is put on trial. We watch Göring skillfully maneuver through Jackson's questioning. Despite its flaws, there is something worthwhile in Vanderbilt's attempt. Kelly eventually wrote his book. It revealed that what occurred in Germany could happen anywhere. The perpetrators of Nazi crimes were ordinary people who embraced a message that told them walking over the bodies of others was worth obtaining power. That aspect of the film is its most compelling. Göring's words sound like those we are hearing today as certain leaders feed us their narratives and push us to create scapegoats. I cannot highly recommend Nuremberg. It loses focus and includes elements that distract from the central story. But it does work as a cautionary tale. Telling a story set in the past can be a great way to talk about the present. Nuremberg shows how. Director-screenwriter James Vanderbilt's historical drama should be impossible to watch without thinking about the genocides, wars, and state repressions happening all over the world, and whether those responsible will ever be held accountable. If you're reading this review on the day it was published, you're likely aware of the latest atrocities, including the kidnapping and detainment without trial of U.S. citizens as well as immigrants by agents of the state. You will think about these crimes again while watching Nuremberg, because that sort of thing is discussed at some length along with human rights violations, war crimes, and the process by which a state's dehumanization of certain classes of citizen can lead to dictatorship, then genocide. The title refers to the city where representatives of 4 allied nations that teamed up to defeat Nazi Germany gathered to try its leaders. Concepts of international law and rules of war had been evolving for thousands of years by then. But the concept of crimes against humanity hadn't been codified. Nor had the idea that a nation needn't have signed a treaty to be bound by international practices. That framing of Nuremberg was controversial. There was large Allied faction that thought the Nazi leadership, and perhaps Nazis further down the ranks as well, should just be put against a wall and shot. That's what usually happened to leaders of countries defeated in a war. It would have been faster and cheaper than a globally televised trial, and the architects of the first mechanized genocide wouldn't have been able to twist media coverage of the event, including radio broadcasts, to spread their ideas. Nuremberg is based on The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, a non-fiction book by Jack L. High about the relationship between Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, the highest-ranking surviving Nazi at Nuremberg, and American psychiatrist Jack Kelly, Rami Malek, who was brought to Nuremberg to evaluate imprisoned Nazi leaders and determine if they were fit to stand trial. As Smithsonian Magazine put it, Kelly wanted to dissect evil by determining whether members of the Nazi high command shared a psychiatric condition that led them to commit unspeakable atrocities, the Holocaust chief among them. Kelly got involved because there was an idealistic post-war push to make sure the men whose orders caused millions of deaths were held responsible for their actions. But his motives weren't pure. He also figured he'd get a best-selling book out of the experience. The movie begins with Göring's arrest and gets us into the story by following the efforts of Supreme Court Associate Justice Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, to convince President Harry Truman's administration to try the Nazis. We get details about the Nuremberg prison and the courtroom, the then recent history of Nuremberg, Germany, and Europe, and the incremental escalation of crimes against state-decreed enemies. But the strange relationship between Kelly and Göring forms the spine of the story. Both actors are exceptional. Crowe shows us why he's one of the last great movie stars as well as a brilliant performer, settling into the high-powered character-actor phase of his career as if it were a ratty old barcalounger with a drink holder in each armrest. Like Gene Hackman in his greatest 80s and 90s performances, Crowe has such a regular guy energy that on those rare occasions when Göring is thwarted or disappointed and we get a glimpse of his capacity for overwhelming violence, it somehow comes as an unsettling surprise within the context of the scene, even though we know the man's a killer. Malek got flack for his Oscar-winning performance as Freddie Mercury in Bohemian Rhapsody, not without justification. But he'd already proved he had the stuff to be an offbeat leading man in the satirical thriller Mr. Robot, which succeeded mainly because of his ability to connect with viewers' emotions. And his work as Kelly confirms why so many filmmakers saw such potential in him. His performance as Kelly is the best he's done in a feature film. Malek communicates Kelly's internal struggles largely through his reactions during conversations and when he's watching the trial unfold. The actor's excellence as a screen listener is foregrounded in scenes where Kelly tries to bond with Göring by providing a rapt audience for his monologues and anecdotes, and serving as a courier for correspondence between Göring and his family, which is in hiding. Malek plays the character as a smart, charming, confident guy who's a bit of a heel, but doesn't quite realize how much of a heel he is. He does this without overemphasizing Kelly's earlier obliviousness or late-stage anger and shame. Ethically, Kelly is shaky from scene 1. He's got one eye on history and another on his personal fortunes. We clock him as slippery from his introductory sequence, which sees him doing sleight of hand magic to fascinate a beautiful young woman on the train to Germany. Kelly's stance that doctor-patient confidentiality should apply even in a military prison was not that firm to start with, and it crumbles when he's asked to personally provide accounts of each session with Göring, so that Jackson can have an advantage when the Nazi boss is on the witness stand. Göring corrupts Kelly further by flattering him into thinking that his empathetic brilliance is what caused Göring to divulge personal secrets. It's actually a textbook example of a charming monster playing a questioner as deftly as Richard Strauss conducted the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra during the war, and as deftly as the Nazis played Strauss. There's an early moment where Göring, who says he doesn't understand English, slips up, but subtly enough that only Kelly notices. Kelly is proud of himself for seeing through Göring, but later we wonder if Göring is so slick that he performed the slip-up with enough precision that it would fool everyone but Kelly. Vanderbilt, whose breakthrough assignment was the adapted script for David Fincher's Zodiac, once again shows his ability to lighten grim subject matter with sardonic humor without seeming disrespectful. Steven Spielberg does this in all of his historical dramas, including Schindler's List, as did Stanley Kubrick. Sometimes the sheer absurdity of a horrible situation demands a bit of humor so as not to come across as dishonest or tediously preachy. There are several chilling early scenes where Göring regards the psychiatrist with an expression that truly does seem disarmed and trusting, but is more akin to a skilled butcher looking at a cow and imagining dotted lines on a cut chart. Goring and Kelly's interactions stand for different ways of thinking about war, genocide, international law, and the ethics of psychiatry, as well the more generalized responsibility to make correct moral decisions even under threat of death. Their scenes also show the allure of eloquent but savage men, who rise to positions of influence by knowing how to manipulate people and can apply the skill to any situation, including a session with a prison psychiatrist. Goring also has aspects of Satan as con artist, breaching his target's moral defenses by going off on funny tangents, and wallowing in whataboutism. When Kelly confronts Goring in his cell about his claim not to know that prisoners were being executed, he changes the subject with, "You think American bullets and bombs might kill civilian people? You vaporize 150,000 Japanese at the touch of a button, and you presume to stand in judgment of me for war crimes." Putting sense in the mouth of the devil is a risky move. But the way Goring reels in everyone, even a man whose job is understanding psychology, shows how dictators and their minions seize power from people who fancy themselves too smart to get played. Nuremberg confirms why, even after the trial, it was easy to draw new generations to fascism, the very thing that the Nuremberg architects hoped the public exposure and punishment of the Nazis would prevent. The many call-outs to non-German war crimes such as the Allied carpet bombing of German cities are defensible here because the movie is a rhetorical Trojan horse of sorts, smuggling barbed observations about contemporary evil and the possibility of holding it to account into a mainstream, big-budget period piece. At 2 hours and 20 minutes, the movie can't deal with every issue it raises, such as the fragility of the psychiatrist's confidentiality oath. The trial feels too brief after so much build-up. Much else gets skipped. The crusading Justice Jackson is etched in fair detail, thanks partly to Shannon's ability to make you feel as if you know exactly who the man is even if you hadn't heard his name before, the kind of guy whose sense of humor is real, but on a delay timer. Other important characters get sketches instead of full portraits, such as the British consul David Maxwell Fyfe, Richard E. Grant, who both complicates and helps Jackson's cause, Nuremberg Commandant Burton C. Andrus, John Slattery, who is reduced to the sort of character John Slattery often plays, unsentimental, cynical, funny, and the 21 other Nazi defendants, including Rudolf Hess, Andreas Piechmann, the deputy Führer who flew a stolen plane to Scotland in 1941, spent the next 4 years locked in the Tower of London, tried to wriggle out of punishment at Nuremberg by faking amnesia, and sat next to Goring during the trial. But altogether, it's a solid film of kind that used to be more common, an earnest, unpretentious Oscar movie that wants to be seen by everyone, and consequently doesn't try to be too complex or arty. It wants to educate and inspire as well as entertain, and isn't shy about that ambition. And it's very effective at making a case for specific contemporary outcomes while seeming as if it's just showing you a dramatization of history. At one point, a character tells us that it happened here because the people made it happen, because they didn't stand up until it was too late. He's talking about Germany, among other places. This is not the first film to take as its subject matter the trial of leading Nazi Party members after the end of the Second World War, and no doubt it won't be the last. 1961's excellent judgment at Nuremberg is perhaps the best, although that dealt with the trial of second-string Nazis in 1947, rather than the remnants of the high command in what we've come to know as the Nuremberg trials, as with this latest movie. The closest we've had to 2025's Nuremberg is the 2-part made-for-TV miniseries of the same name starring Alec Baldwin and Brian Cox, released in 2000. On first viewing, I'd say that the new film, despite being made for cinema with the bigger budget that implies, doesn't quite live up to the earlier effort. That's based on a quick revisiting of the similar ground covered 25 years ago, courtesy of a free showing via YouTube. First viewings can be deceptive, but, speaking personally, I tend to enjoy films more on first viewing, especially when seen on the big screen. So I suspect my first impression that this movie didn't quite live up to my expectations, nor to the largely positive reviews it's received so far will stand. In both movies, it's the character of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that dominates. As Göring was the highest-ranking Nazi to survive to face trial, if we ignore the fact that Hitler stripped him of all official positions and honors in his last political testament, that is only to be expected. The new movie concentrates heavily on the relationship between Göring and the American psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, played by Rami Malek, and is based on Jack L. High's book on the same subject, with perhaps some influence from Kelly's own account in his own book, 22 Cells at Nuremberg. The weakest performance, and one that is important given how much of the film rests upon it, came from Rami Malek as Kelly, a performance that was too broad and lacking in subtlety for my taste. Some parts of the movie, such as Kelly sneaking off to pass letters back and forth between Göring and his wife and daughter, seemed almost certainly an invention, though presumably they are also present in the original source material. Having praised the pace of the direction, I do think we took far too long to get to the courtroom scenes, and what we did get was nowhere near enough. What was needed at this point was a gotcha moment where the prosecution turned the tables on Göring, using insights gleaned from Kelly's many hours of discussion with the former Reichsmarschall. The script tried to provide this, but all we got via the intervention of Maxwell Fyfe was a list of the positions Göring held in the party and state between 1942 and 1944, based on Kelly's assertion that Göring would never, even if his own neck literally depended on it, speak against the memory of his late Führer. I don't know how accurate this was to the court transcripts, but it seemed nowhere near enough in itself to prove Göring's guilt, whether in regard to the fate of Europe's Jews or to the planning of aggressive war in Europe. It was not enough to cause Göring to crumble in the dock, which, despite comments to the contrary, we didn't really see anyway, merely a lessening of his up to that point self-assured arrogance. In addition, the courtroom scenes were overloaded with melodrama, with pained glances between the prosecution team when Göring made a good point, and euphoric looks when Jackson did likewise, as though they were partisans at a sporting occasion rather than participants in a historic and groundbreaking legal procedure. How Göring procured, or managed to conceal for a year and a half despite presumably numerous and thorough personal searches the cyanide capsule that enabled him to cheat the hangman's noose was not addressed, other than the suggestion that it was somehow linked to a sleight of hand magic trick learned from Kelly, which seems unlikely. As we, almost 70 years later, still don't know the answer to this question, though help from a sympathetic guard seems the favorite, it would have been better not to raise the issue at all. The film should rightly have ended with Göring's death, but instead we were treated to the sight of Julius Streicher, played rather cartoonishly by Dieter Riesel. Streicher sobs with fear in his cell before being coaxed to his fate by Trieste. I found the scene extremely gratuitous, serving no purpose other than to show that these war criminals, whose decisions and actions led to the deaths of tens of millions, met their own deaths as sniveling cowards. This may or may not have been true in Streicher's case, but it certainly wasn't true of all those convicted. I don't know the details of how each of them met their end, but I do know that, to give one instance, ex-Foreign Minister Ribbentrop defiantly shouted Deutschland über alles before the hood was placed on his head. At any rate, I thought it a bad way to end the film, somewhat redeemed by an epilogue about what became of some of the central protagonists which, in the case of Kelly, and I won't spoil it for those who, like me before this movie, don't know his post-war fate, came as a genuine surprise. Today, in the last film we will be looking at for 2025, we have come across one that has given me pause as to how conflicted I am towards it. On the surface, we have a film that could not be timelier as a reminder to a lot of people out there that their time will come and I was only following orders will not stand. But it also feels like a film that found the wrong anchor to focus on, and that is an issue for me. So, to set the scene, Adolf Hitler is dead. It is in the closing days of WW2 and Nazi Germany is falling apart. The remaining members of the regime are working out whether to run, hide, turn themselves in, or follow Hitler. On May 7, 1945, the last day of the war in Europe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, surrendered himself in Austria. In Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg, Dr. Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, and his translator, Sgt. Howie Trieste, Leo Woodall, had been tasked with a secret mission to look after the mental health of the German regime as they prepared to put them on trial. Kelly sees this as an excellent money-making exercise, but is he truly prepared to investigate the awfully benign face of evil incarnate? One of the strengths of this film is just how solid a production it is. The cast, the score, the cinematography, the set design, the costuming, and well, just about everything is as good as you can get it. There is a classic feel to this film, like I have seen its caliber before, one that draws in big-name actors, even if it was for small roles. Indeed, the most recent comparable example, though on a bigger scale, would be Oppenheimer. It is those small production details that help define a film, help bring you into a narrative, and they clearly found some of the best in the business. It also helps that it does not beat around the bush when it gets down to the business of exploring the Nazis' war crimes. It is confronting, horrific, and completely necessary for this film. Another strength is the idea of basing a film around the Nuremberg trials, one of the most fascinating and impactful results of the Second World War. This time period gives you so much to play with from a narrative perspective. The trials were almost unprecedented, they were full of interesting characters to draw from, and the Iron Curtain had yet to fall. I mean that this is a film that can strong-arm a pope and make you feel that this was probably the right course of action. You have the pressures of those looking for a better short-term response, that is, take them out the back and shoot them, contend with those looking at a better long-term outcome. The very idea that people should be held to account for crimes against humanity. However, when tackling a film like this, when you are so removed from the time, you need an anchor, a hook, for the audience to latch onto, to take you through the story. For the purposes of this film, they chose one of the psychiatrists, Dr. Douglas Kelly, and unfortunately for the movie, I feel this was the wrong choice for two reasons. The first is that the film provides significantly more interesting characters to explore. This becomes even more apparent in the back half of the film, where you can feel them trying to find reasons for Douglas to be there. The other issue is that Rami Malek is unfortunately not the right choice for this role. I cannot tell you if this is a casting or a directing issue, but Rami is giving a very similar performance that he has given in previous roles, and while that may have worked in No Time to Die, here it falters in the face of other players in the film. Russell Crowe is unnervingly captivating from the moment he arrives on screen. Leo Woodall brings the much-needed heart and grounding to the film. John Slattery and Michael Shannon bring the strength, and I think the film needed more Richard E. Grant. In the end, do we recommend Nuremberg? This is a difficult question to answer because this is a film that flies high and crashes low. While there are some issues, at its core, Nuremberg is still a fascinating look at an event that is just as relevant today as it was 80 years ago. Its missteps don't diminish the importance of the story it's trying to tell. They just dramatically limit the potential reach of what could have been a phenomenal film. Have you watched Nuremberg? Let us know what you thought in the comments below. If you liked Nuremberg, while it might be an odd choice to you, we would recommend Godzilla -1 to you because it is one of the few films that has an honest conversation about the effects of WW2 on a people and society. Hermann Goering surrenders. Unlike other magicians, he cannot produce a handkerchief of the appropriate color, so a torn bit of hem will do. Having addressed crowds on the triumphal concrete plazas so lovingly documented by Leni Riefenstahl in the aftermath, he is shown as short of a pocket square. It's not the only lack in the film. Based on a book, itself inspired by another's book, history is only written by the victors because structural forces find it hard to hold a pen. Great men, then, in the aftermath of a great conflict, portrayed by a great cast, but their labors are undercut. The presentation of footage of Auschwitz, Belsenbergen, concentration camps where liberation came too late to save many from the mass graves. The BBFC rating text mentions images of real dead bodies but also Holocaust references, and there are difficult conversations to be had about how Nuremberg presents both those crimes against humanity and the prosecution thereof. Russell Crowe is intermittently charming as Goering, but Bugonia and Frankenstein are overwhelmingly more effective in humanizing their villains and showing the monstrousness in men. That might be the freedom of fiction, but at this remove the description of inspired by true events is attempting to paper over chasms. Rami Malek is Dr. Douglas Kelly, an army psychiatrist stationed at Nuremberg. He's charged in part with the care and analysis of the surviving Nazi leaders held there, including Reichsmarschall Goering. He would write a book, 22 Cells at Nuremberg, and many of the criticisms in the New York Times contemporary review of that work ring true for the film. The story of his time would become the Nazi and the psychiatrist. Its author, Jack L. High, is credited as co-writer with director James Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's best work is probably his adaptation of another non-fiction work in Zodiac, but his adapted screenplays included 2022 Scream and non-superhero comic book caper The Losers. His most geopolitical conspiracy work thus far was White House Down. This is only his second feature, and though he's got a great cast on both sides of the news, the film is never quite able to harness them. Malek's Kelly is a man of confidence, and with Leo Woody's young translator he sets about winning over the inmates. His opposition is various, as are the obstacles before Michael Shannon's Justice Robert H. Jackson. He's depicted here as the architect of the trials, and while he's arguably responsible for the language of crimes against humanity, his depiction elides the contributions of countless other judges and jurists. Those include the first Earl of Kilmuir, played by Richard E. Grant, whose contributions extend beyond alcohol as a character shorthand. Call it Chekhov's gin and it becomes a moment where the court seems more of tennis than testimony. It relies on often clumsy exposition, a common construction of only if X with a cut to X has happened leaves one asking why. There are endless reaction shots, and as respite from that archive footage they undercut the repeated message to never look away. Others might tell us to come and see, but Nuremberg is intent too often on telling and not showing. There have been countless films of and about the era, there's a red dress that might be borrowed from one. There's been film of the filming of these trials, and while this uses archive footage, there's a comic sequence of Rudolf Hess' trip to Scotland that seems more of a pastiche in the vein of Whiskey Galore than anything else. Given the other inaccuracies, it'd be churlish to complain that it's the wrong kind of aircraft, but with matters of this importance the capacity for forgiveness is slight. The use of Brian Tyler's score is also heavy-handed. Given his vast filmography, it was a matter of probability that he'd have worked on something with cinematographer Darius Wolski before, and that film, 2008's Eagle Eye, is another one where intent and outcome don't quite align. Everyone involved has done better work. The script labors with portent and under the specter of both history and news. I paraphrase a little, but a line that amounts to, "I'm a Supreme Court justice, I can't support shooting someone without a trial," is as jarring as repeated assertions of "never again." Two men loudly arguing in a room could feel stagey, but rather than the thrill of the theatrical, one sometimes wonders if they were there at the same time. At least a play would likely have an intermission. At almost all of 2.5 hours the film's pacing is not only off but differently so. It dawdles when it should dart, skips when it should be steady. It looks great in places, but that's despite a lack of focus. Nuremberg gets halfway towards a battle of wits but falls short in the execution. What if we could dissect evil? That's the question posed by Douglas Kelly, played by Rami Malek in Nuremberg. An ambitious psychiatrist, Kelly is tasked with assessing the mental state of Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, while the former Reichsmarschall awaits trial. World War II has just ended. Adolf Hitler has killed himself. The chief U.S. prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, a Supreme Court justice, argues against a swift execution of the Nazi high command for the atrocities they planned and oversaw. Jackson wants them judged by international law, for international judges from Allied forces sitting on an unprecedented tribunal, the first courtroom trial to confront Nazi Germany's invasions of other European countries and genocide against millions of Jewish people. Before what would be known as the Nuremberg trials, Kelly must try to understand Göring. He learns less about the origin of evil than about humans having the capacity to do unthinkably awful things and then justify those actions through a warped worldview. Hannah Arendt coined the phrase "the banality of evil" about such cases. And just as 2023's The Zone of Interest depicted, Nuremberg captures how the Holocaust was not carried out by some supernatural evil but by everyday people so entrenched in their beliefs, ambition, and power that they committed horrific acts against their fellow human beings. Based on Jack Elhay's 2013 book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, writer-director James Vanderbilt's film has disturbing modern-day parallels. It's also a stately production, presented in a classical mode that's sure to appeal to old-school Oscar voters. However, a similar theme appeared in last year's superior Norwegian feature, Quisling, The Final Days, where a priest, Anders Danielsen Lie, interviews Vidkun Quisling, Gard B. Eidsvold, the leader of Norway's puppet government for Hitler. Both that film and Nuremberg follow the same trajectory, and while I prefer the former, there's much to appreciate about Vanderbilt's effort here. Whereas Stanley Kramer's Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, spent over 3 hours on the subject, with much of its runtime situated in the courtroom, Vanderbilt devotes most of his story to Kelly's pre-trial assessment of Göring. Kelly wants to explore what drives the Nazis' brand of evil to write a book about it, earn a hefty payday, and ensure something like the Holocaust never happens again. However, Kelly has an ironic mission similar to Burton C. Andrus, John Slattery, the U.S. Army colonel who oversees the 22 prisoners awaiting their trial. He must keep the Nazis alive long enough to face their inevitable execution. When Kelly first meets Göring, he observes the man's unabashed narcissism, failing health, and addiction to opiates stemming from wartime injuries. There's a cat-and-mouse quality initially, where Kelly attempts to outwit Göring, who speaks English but pretends he cannot to earn a tactical advantage. Göring remains certain he will escape conviction and the hangman's noose. Meanwhile, Jackson works out the legal logistics of trying this case alongside other prosecutors from England, Russia, and France, chief among them, the British representative, David Maxwell Fyfe, Richard E. Grant. Jackson also needs the support of the Pope, who ostensibly validated Hitler's reign in 1933. The actual trial doesn't begin until nearly 2 hours into the feature, leaving Jackson's 10-minute cross-examination of Göring for the climactic scene. Until then, Kelly tries to understand Göring by meeting his wife and children and listening to Göring's assessment of how Hitler made us feel German again and promised to help reclaim our former glory. Göring also claims ignorance about what happened at the concentration camps, insisting that Heinrich Himmler oversaw them. His "not my department" explanation falls through later, and Kelly loses any respect he might have gained from Göring when Jackson shows the court nightmarish footage of the death camps and the scope of genocide. How could he not have known? Much of Nuremberg's heavy dramatic lifting falls on Malek and Crowe, who handle their scenes well, although Crowe's iffy German accent sounds vaguely similar to his Italian accent in The Pope's Exorcist, 2023. Vanderbilt's production allows for plenty of showboating among the cast, whose performances are reinforced by Brian Tyler's heightened score. Dariusz Wolski's cinematography, captured in a brown-gray palette, doesn't dwell on the courtroom stage as much as the faces of those involved, mainly in medium and close-up shots. Vanderbilt and editor Tom Eagles also weave in archival footage and several sobering minutes of actual footage from concentration camps shown in the courtroom. The effect is that neither Göring nor any of Hitler's cronies could claim ignorance or that they were just following orders. The Third Reich could not have executed the level of planning and coordination required for its final solution without the knowledge and participation of its leaders. A movie like Nuremberg, wrapped in the prestigious airs of an Oscar-Beatty production, may not offer a new take on the trials. But watching it, I kept thinking about how some kid might find the movie on Netflix and learn about humanity's dark past, and perhaps even draw some parallels to today. That's something. A survey by the Claims Conference shows that awareness and knowledge about the Holocaust among young adults in the United States are severely lacking. While the Trump administration purges information about the Holocaust from government websites, removes related books from national libraries, and narrows the scope of Holocaust education in American schools. Vanderbilt's work helps raise awareness and emphasize the contemporary parallels. In the final scenes, Kelly has become a disenchanted alcoholic because people let it happen. His faith in humanity irreparably damaged, he warns that fascism can and does exist in America, and that another Holocaust could happen here. Everyone thinks he's a crackpot, and his warnings go unheeded. Today, his claims wouldn't sound so implausible, they'd be stating the obvious. The biggest challenge facing Nuremberg, the historical drama about the post-World War II Nazi trials, is that audiences can take a brief glimpse into today's newspaper and read about an abundance of unchecked war crimes still taking place across the globe. Despite the precedent of individual accountability that the trials established, history tends to repeat itself. The second biggest issue facing Nuremberg is the script's lack of emotional sincerity. Attempts at clever scene transitions and a tone aiming for a suspenseful courtroom drama feel excruciatingly inappropriate. Despite a strong performance from Russell Crowe and the film's timely release, Nuremberg fails to capture the tragedy, the sensitivity, and the momentousness of its subject matter. Nuremberg follows Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, Bohemian Rhapsody, the military intelligence officer assigned the task of analyzing the mental states of Hermann Göring, one of the top Nazi commanders under Adolf Hitler, and 21 other Nazi inmates awaiting trial at Nuremberg prison. In his best performance since 2016's Nice Guys, Crowe plays Göring, imbuing the captured officer with unnerving menace, immense physical presence, and incorruptible self-aggrandizing. The film also spends time with the Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, Knives Out, who President Truman appointed as U.S. Chief of Counsel at the Nuremberg trials. As each character prepares for the trial, the global implications and personal stakes involved are laid out clearly, but ineffectually. Part of the script's problem is that there are too many moving pieces, so the central philosophical question at the film's core, how could people resort to such evil and how can the world hold them accountable, is unable to be properly explored. Additionally, Malek is either miscast or unsure how to play his character, cycling through awkward egotistical charm and hiding behind a veil of ignorance while eventually coming to a ridiculous aha moment. While Nuremberg is the type of historical drama that proliferated in the 1990s, the new film lacks emotional resonance, a characteristic that would be blended well, if not manipulatively, into the narratives of Nuremberg's predecessors, Schindler's List, Amistad, Malcolm X, Nixon, etc. Instead, as the trial commences in Nuremberg, we are shown the same horrific Holocaust footage that was shown in the actual trial. This was the first time such atrocities of the Holocaust were made public. The footage is horrific and absolutely sickening. Unfortunately, because of the more light-hearted tone leading up to this point, the filmmaker's decision to include the footage so unceremoniously and thoroughly feels calculating and aimed at shock value. Our reaction to the footage is powerful, but it hasn't been earned. Is it better for a film like Nuremberg to exist or not exist if it falls short of appropriately capturing its subject matter? Often, Nuremberg feels like the script has taken the most interesting facts on the Wikipedia pages of all the individuals and courtroom proceedings, and then stitched them together. This scattered feeling is made worse by off-putting scene transitions, like when one scene ends in a character exclaiming, "As long as we don't experience a problem," and cutting to the next scene with a character saying, "We have a problem." This writing cheat happens 5 or 6 times. So, again, is Nuremberg approachable and factual enough to warrant its existence, since it could be shown in classrooms to spark discussions, and noticed on streaming platforms as a starting point for young adults interested in learning more on the subject? The answer, arguably, is yes. In today's world, where history is beginning to repeat itself, any form of warning helps. It's surprising how there aren't many courtroom dramas based on historic trials, even though the genre has one of the earliest classic masterpieces with Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc that managed to dramatize a trial with tremendous visual bravado for a silent film. It's a tremendous film, one of those classics every film historian studies and every film student needs to cover in their first year. But since then, not much. Where's the film on the Burr conspiracy? David Niven played Aaron Burr in The Magnificent Doll in 1946, but that was more about a fictional romantic triangle and less about the trial. De Palma's The Untouchables is more about the agents that investigated Capone and ends right when the juicy law stuff is about to kick in. And for that matter, how come it took Hollywood so long to dramatize the arguably most famous trial of recent history? That last one is a question that I think filmmaker James Vanderbilt was asking himself while making Nuremberg, because his film is built like a classic 90s award season bait of the prestige Hollywood era, coming in strong with a strong cast, a classic and dramatic score, and the emotional sledgehammer of an idea that is not interested in the subtlety of its subject matter. The story is framed around psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, assigned by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson to oversee the incarceration of a series of high-ranking Nazi officers before their trial in Nuremberg. The official case is to ensure the prisoners do not take their own life before they must answer for their crimes, but Kelly takes this as an opportunity to analyze the men responsible for one of the biggest atrocities committed by humans. A perfect subject for a book, and to understand if this was a case of collective madness, or something more complex. Central to his study is the big fish of the prisoners, Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, who we first see being captured in a car with his family driving and willingly handing himself in to the authorities. So, let's be honest, the trial here is background noise. It encompasses the second half of the second act, and mostly to heighten some dramatic flair to Göring's personality and the complications of Kelly's research. The juice of the film is relegated to Kelly's interactions with Göring and his fascination of how can a man, seemingly so normal and humanized, be involved in genocide. The film makes a good case for this approach and goes with Justice Jackson's reasoning of why the men should face trial and not instantly be sentenced to death. The through line from Hannah Arendt's banality of evil is puzzling to us even today, but while something like Jonathan Glazer's Zone of Interest explored this idea with a minutiae of an almost scientific lens, Nuremberg approaches only at surface level. It's all very cleaned and built on the shoulders of these fine actors, giving their best prestige performance. And what a cast it is. Crowe almost stands out by chewing the scenery with such determination he almost misses the point of Göring, which should be to be perceived as weak, charming, and larger than life. Shannon should get more roles like this, he's grounded like that, and a collection of critically acclaimed actors stop by in small scenes in automatic, but effective mode, including Colin Hanks as a rival psychiatrist, Richard E. Grant as the British Deputy Chief Prosecutor Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, and John Slattery. Playing a no-fuss U.S. general, the most John Slattery role. Nuremberg would have been the biggest film of the year in 1995, but even then, it wouldn't have broken any boundaries. There's something so old school about how it looks and plays, like this was an idea a studio had 3 decades ago, to be directed by Ron Howard on top of his career or a Lasse Hallström campaigning for an Academy Award. But nowadays audiences have different appetites, especially in the award season, more focused on complex emotional variations and nuanced ideas. So, Nuremberg is not a bad film, but it's little above a historical editorialist account of one of the most important trials in human history. There are big ideas that resonate, but the film doesn't explore them to the best of its capacity. In an important moment, the camera notes how the German Nazis react to the harrowing footage from the concentration camps. Watching that in 2025, it's hard not to correlate to today, when war atrocities are spread on social media as they happen, and the people from the countries perpetrating them remain unfazed by the images, actively rationalizing the events as if anything justifies the death of innocent lives. Kelly's book blamed these men's drive on ambition and nationalism. Nothing more banal than that. From second-time director, and screenwriter of films such as The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Scream 6, Murder Mystery 2, and Zodiac, comes a film about the historic Nuremberg trials in the immediate wake of the close of the Second World War. While the film is rife with star power, To name just a few, the cast includes Russell Crowe, Rami Malek, Michael Shannon, and Richard E. Grant, yet the result of their work is an incredibly routine crime procedural with all the screenwriting heft of a later Mission Impossible sequel. Despite the shortcomings of the film, I cannot help but feel it is worth championing at a time where anti-Semitism, global tension, and historical ambiguity and ignorance have become mainstream. First, let me make it clear that I am every cliché of the adult male who as they grow older becomes increasingly more fascinated by World War II and history more broadly. At present I am reading the Associated Press book Victory, World War II in Real Time, shown above. While I am just a little over halfway through the book, the most striking thing I have found within it is the pacifying language with which the Axis powers utilized to justify their actions. You see, unlike most history books, this is not the work of a single author, rather, it is a series of newspaper articles written at the time of the Second World War, meaning the book is a primary source of information. In reading history books and watching documentaries, it is easy to get swept up in the collision of nations, horrors of the past, and the dichotomy between the victors and the losers. However, such a broad view can at times ignore the whitewashing of the actions taken in history, wherein sweeping moves and malevolent acts are attempted to be pacified by those ushering them in. Of the things I found most admirable about Vanderbilt's Nuremberg film was how it explored a nuanced view of history, wherein simplistic notions of evil had to be negotiated within a courtroom where evidence and what one can prove were more important than what we assume to be true. In its exploration of unmasking the evil hidden behind a human mask, Vanderbilt explores the fascinating relationship between Rami Malek's Douglas Kelly, a psychiatrist tasked with ascertaining the competency of Nuremberg defendants, and its most notorious villain Hermann Göring, played by Russell Crowe. The film is quite heavy-handed with its imagery and comparisons drawn between magic/sleight-of-hand trickery and the sort of groundswell of support thrown behind the National Socialist German Workers' Party thanks to the ability of its leader Adolf Hitler to project imagined power atop his populist platform. As Malek goes about deconstructing the psychology of Crowe to the point that they speak a common language, he begins to find it easy to sort of get swept up in the naturalism of his presentation of incredible moments in history despite their horrendous impact. It is incredibly easy to become radicalized. That was true in 1946, and it is true now. It is dangerous to listen to certain figures. Just listen to a Donald Trump rally. His language is simplistic. The images he draws with his words are atrocious, yet, the combined fervor of the crowd and rambling naturalism of his speech is also intoxicating. In a world where the problems we are faced with seem overwhelming, the horrors of war can be shown to us on our phones, and everything seems to be coming undone. It is understandable why some throw up their hands and give over their mental constitution to the gentle caress of tyrannical rule. Why bother trying to solve all of these immense troubles we are faced with when we can simply assume everything will be okay if we give over all of that responsibility to a single figure? We live in a world where lost men are turning to the monosphere of toxicity, where anti-Semitic content and comments are not shunned but bolstered by algorithms and users as they have become a populistic target once again. While Nuremberg does not illuminate anything about populism, how democracies crumble, or the rise of tyranny that is not already well known or has been done with more nuance, I think now more than ever it is a message we need to heed. While the importance of its message is pertinent, I also feel compelled to lay clear how incredibly basic and flat the film is. In terms of form, this film boasts some of the most forgettable/limited sense of scale cinematography, and muted color grading that I have seen in some time. Additionally, while there are times where the performances are strong, most notably the scenes shared between Crowe and Malek and later Shannon and Crowe, there are an abundance of moments of bombastically Hollywood-stylized dialogue that made it hard to take the film seriously. More specifically, there are innumerable instances in the film where actors go about expositing about what an incredible challenge they are faced with just for it to quick cut to them immediately solving it. Think of those moments in Mission Impossible where Tom Cruise stares into the camera with a smug grin after Simon Pegg or Ving Rhames goes on a diatribe about how everything has gone wrong and it is up to Ethan Hunt to come up with an improbable solution. While this sort of script may be functional in an action film, it feels entirely incongruent with material that engages with the lasting consequence of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Despite all of its shortcomings, it is also true in my view that thanks to the history the film grapples with, along with the talented cast that brought the limited script to life, the film does become compelling. Take the final courtroom drama between Crowe's Goring and Shannon's Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, who is prosecuting him. Therein there is a fascinating conflict as Shannon goes about trying to hang Crowe by his words, yet the defendant is able to twist them in such a way as to pass off blame and shield himself from recrimination. To me, it was one of the most chilling moments in the film, especially in view of recent events where unprovoked invasions of sovereign powers are labeled special military operations or law enforcement operations. Again, the scene is rife with Hollywoodisms, from reaction shots of onlookers cheering for Shannon to get him to later when Richard E. Grant has his Perry Mason moment of unveiling Crowe's unwavering devotion to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. Still, it is overall an interesting look at how the pacifying language of states can shield them from blame even when we all know the true horrors of their motivation. Before my final thoughts, I wanted to recommend the above video from the History Hit channel, which does an excellent job exploring the Nuremberg trials, wherein for the first time domestic actions were adjudicated in such a way as to showcase there being a basis for international law. Again, the United States' involvement at Nuremberg is ironic in retrospect, given that they later withdrew from recognizing the International Criminal Court. Lastly, on the topic of history, one inaccuracy I noted while watching the film was Shannon's colleague stating that Nazi Germany never attacked the United States, which is wrong. Just look at the incident of the SS Robin Moore, an American cargo ship sunk by Nazi Germany prior to Pearl Harbor being attacked. While it is true that America was not at war with Nazi Germany at the time, her statement is still false due to the various instances of German engagements with American vessels in the Atlantic Ocean. In total, Nuremberg is not a film I imagine will win any awards this year at the Oscars, thanks to its lackluster script, almost total absence of any formal flair, and underwhelming lead performances. That is not to say that it is without merit or entirely bad. There are moments where the film's exploration of evil, history, and the lasting consequence of war are deeply compelling, especially in light of the world we find ourselves living in today, and in those scenes the cast is stellar. However, it pales in comparison to the abundance of routine moments and static drama, which is a shame given the material it is exploring. At its best, I agree with others who have commented that this is the sort of film history teachers will show their class when covering World War II, and maybe that is okay. I can still remember the day when my teacher showed the class a video of the Nazi concentration camps while the song Mad World by Gary Jules played, and it forever changed me. We all need an introduction to history, and I think as that the movie could be serviceable, and it is worth watching, but it is not the sort of film that stands out in any one remarkable way. To close, here is a song which I think reflects the message laid out at the end of the film. As the smoke was beginning to clear in Europe from the wreckage and devastation of World War II, the Allied victors of America, France, England, and the Soviet Union agreed to try something radical. They held an international joint tribunal, charging several Nazi officials and members of Hitler's high command with crimes against humanity. In a groundbreaking legal verdict, they were found guilty and hanged for crimes against humanity. While it may seem like settled history now, it was a risk without a guaranteed victory. The new film Nuremberg, which opened in theaters November 7 and which I recently saw play at the 34th Philadelphia Film Festival, plunges us back into that uncertainty. And it comes at a time when the moral conclusions of history may be more tenuous than we thought, when hate is more and more normalized. How did we get back here? The film opens in 1945 with a long march of war refugees, in search of a place out of the rubble, accompanied by a brigade of American soldiers. The dust is starting to settle on the war. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler are all dead. Suddenly, a car with Nazi flags and insignia starts driving toward the soldiers. To their shock, it is Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, Hitler's second in command and the Nazi Reichsmarschall. He is fleeing Germany with his family, but he does not seem too surprised to be caught. Unlike his leader and his colleagues, he has not taken a way out via cyanide pill. He curiously presents as confident and unafraid. While Göring's military service may be over, it seems like he is already planning another chapter. Rami Malek, Bohemian Rhapsody, co-stars as Douglas Kelly, the army psychiatrist tasked with determining Göring's psychological fitness to stand trial, as well as that of his subordinates Rudolf Hess, Julius Streicher, and Karl Dönitz. Kelly's main focus soon becomes Göring. Kelly quickly and easily diagnoses Göring as a narcissist. He is highly manipulative, with an unquenchable thirst for power and a belief in his inherent right to have power over others. It is not, however, Kelly's job to prosecute him. That falls to Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, at the time an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Göring denies knowledge of the concentration camps and believes the Nazis were entitled to land grabs in Poland based on the theory that they were once a part of Germany. He showcases a cunning ability to deny everything, then turn the tables back on his opponents. Kelly shares grave doubts about whether Jackson should let Göring take the stand and give him perhaps his biggest megaphone yet. Jackson, however, believes that the best way to prevent something like the Holocaust from happening again is to have Göring explain himself to a hopefully appalled human race. But could Göring's powerful skills of manipulation manage to further infect humanity, even if in small but potent corners? This has echoes of today, with high-profile debates about platforming known white supremacists, anti-Semites, and hate-mongers on social media, podcasts and in the news. We reflect on an ideology we thought was vanquished, that feels new again in an unwelcoming fashion. Jewish points of view are largely absent from Nuremberg, despite a scene where a character's hidden Judaism comes to the fore. But there are some revealing moments when members of the Nazi high command are given actual Rorschach tests. In their interpretations, they show a delusional, pathological hatred of the Jewish people. The filmgoer watches their reactions and feels not so much fear but bafflement at just how delusional and detached from reality that demagoguery and hate can make someone. Nuremberg is the type of story that deserves to be told and retold, so that future generations will know the history. This is the kind of movie that used to play in multiplexes all the time. A movie for adults. A period piece with modest aspirations. Some would call it middlebrow. Yet the movie feels almost too familiar, an overly talky drama with predictable emotional beats, even wandering into the territory of storytelling cliches. For example, Kelly quickly becomes a little too friendly with Göring, which means either that Kelly is not a particularly skilled psychiatrist or Göring is just too good at being manipulative. Perhaps both things are true. Considering the history, it feels a bit stomach-turning to see writer/director James Vanderbilt, who adapted the screenplay from the 2013 book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist by Jack L. High, lean into Göring as a sort of secondary protagonist. Films like Silence of the Lambs come to mind, as their relationship bears similarities to the one between Clarice Starling, Jodie Foster, and the crazed serial killer Dr. Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins. Yet in The Silence of the Lambs, director Jonathan Demme never lets you forget who Lecter is. The extent to which he is humanized is chilling, not so much normalized as Vanderbilt does with Göring. When Kelly even seems to strike up a friendship with Göring's wife and daughter, I must say I rolled my eyes a bit. Russell Crowe gives a strong performance, having embraced his later career shift from leading man towards husky villain roles. The familiarity the viewer has with Crowe feels disarming, underlining Göring's ease with manipulation. For his part, Rami Malek jumps into the role of the psychiatrist with both feet, but he jumps too hard. Malek may be an Oscar winner, but here, his acting is simply too much for the screen, the kind of scenery chewing more suited to the stage. Even if the movie falls short in some of the ways I've noted, it still feels like an important story to revisit today. I would rather have 5 more of these cinematic history lessons every year than an 11th installment of Fast and Furious. The 2025 edition of the Toronto International Film Festival featured a few historical and political dramas. One of them was writer-director James Vanderbilt's Nuremberg, based on Jack L. High's 2013 nonfiction book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. The film is a retelling of the events leading up to and throughout the Nuremberg trials which brought the Nazi high command to justice after World War II. It was a seminal moment in world history, a first-of-its-kind international war crimes tribunal presided over by justices from the Allied countries. Starring Oscar winners Russell Crowe, Gladiator, and Rami Malek, Bohemian Rhapsody, the film See Psychiatrist USLT. Colonel Douglas Kelly, Malek, assigned to assess Nazi second-in-command Hermann Göring, Crowe, and the other Nazi commanding prior to standing trial. The two strike up a type of friendship, but soon we learn that trust may have been misguided. Göring is confident that he will one day return to his family following the trial. Meanwhile, Kelly has ambitions and sees this interaction with Göring, and the book that he will write, as his ticket to making a name for himself. Despite its dark themes and aesthetic, Nuremberg is a stunning and visually rich viewing experience, from its set design and costume design to its scenery and cinematography. But the film wouldn't be what it is without nomination-worthy performances from Crowe and Malek. With his accent, mannerisms, and wardrobe, Crowe completely embodies the menacing, narcissistic and cerebral Göring, who is self-assured and always feels one step ahead, the smartest person in the room. Meanwhile, Malek shines as the fiery and equally cerebral and self-assured Colonel Kelly, who is every bit Göring's intellectual match. Together, Crowe and Malek are simply dynamic on screen. In character, the two go back and forth in a kind of chess match that leaves you wondering whether, in the end, either of them actually came out on top. The film also features strong performances from Leo Woodall as the boyish English-German translator SGT. Howie Trieste, who kind of befriends Colonel Kelly, and Michael Shannon as the sometimes in over his head Nuremberg prosecutor and U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson. Both literally and figuratively, Nuremberg is a dark and haunting story that's still relevant today. In a time when race politics and extremism are on the rise globally, it's a cautionary tale about how far society can go if left unchecked. When looking at the Nazi regime and all the death that followed it, the film asks a haunting question: how did this happen, which ultimately leaves viewers to ask not only can this happen again, but is this happening right now? Nuremberg may feel heavy to some viewers as it includes graphic scenes of starvation, violence, and suicide, and no real happy ending, but as a film and story, it's a magnificent piece of storytelling that we can all learn from. Kevin Bourne is Shifter's Toronto-based editor and senior entertainment reporter focusing on black music and film and TV. He was named one of 340 international voters for the Golden Globe Awards and a Tomatometer-approved critic by Rotten Tomatoes. What to do when a great actor is stuck in a not-so-great movie? You bite the bullet and watch anyway if the actor in question is Russell Crowe. And he's at his cunning, commanding best as Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, a Nazi whose soft-pedaled narcissism gives him gobs of unearned confidence. Enough to fool the International Tribunal at Nuremberg, where he'll stand trial for war crimes with 21 other Nazis in the high command? That's the idea. Ideas are otherwise in short supply in Nuremberg, now in theaters, where writer-director James Vanderbilt hopes to fool audiences into thinking this gloss job over the facts actually has something to say. There was more complexity in 1961's Judgment at Nuremberg, an all-star, awards-bait, concentration camp drama in which defense attorney, Oscar winner Maximilian Schell, argued that German guilt must be shared with Hitler supporters worldwide, including the Soviet Union, the Vatican, Winston Churchill, and American industrialists. The new Nuremberg finds it easier to focus on whether an army psychiatrist, U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Kelly, a sometimes comically intense Rami Malek, can trip up Göring while deciding if he's fit to stand trial. Of course he can take the stand or there'd be no movie. And there's not much of one anyway, as the script underlines everything obvious in Jack L. High's 2013 novel The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. Still, Crowe keeps us riveted, with Göring speaking German until Kelly suckers him into conversing in English, which the sly old fox does beautifully. He also never drops his air of privilege. Even while surrendering to the Allies, Hitler's best buddy asks for someone to carry his luggage. That someone is a foregone conclusion. Kelly seems besotted, transferring messages from the good-humored monster to his wife Emmy, Lottie Verbeek, and their daughter. Is Kelly really falling for Göring's charm act? Or is he using their bogus friendship to get material for a probable bestseller? In this film, the obvious answer is always the right one. The film is here for the trials, dreamed up by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, played by Michael Shannon, with a restraint few others in this cast attempt to adopt. One exception is Leo Woodall, a baddie in the conspiracy to kill Jennifer Coolidge in The White Lotus Season 2, as a secretive American soldier assigned to the case who casts a wary eye on the suspicious doings between Kelly and Göring. The tensions come to a boil when Göring stops with the soft sell and shows Kelly why he's not to be trifled with. It seems clear that Oscar winners Crowe, Gladiator, and Malek, Bohemian Rhapsody, signed on to this film to enact this clash of wills. And both deliver the fireworks. Still, this is Crowe's game all the way. It's Göring's hubris, his loyalty to his now dead Führer, that trips him up. That and the decision in court to show documentary footage from the camps of horrific Nazi crimes against their Jewish captives. Those present in the court are stunned. And those watching this movie will be as well. The tragic fact is we need to see and re-see this heinous evidence, not just to school stupid Holocaust deniers but to remind us of the genocide that followed and still follows in its wake. We can argue the morality of attaching this harrowing historical record to a frivolous melodrama that calls itself Nuremberg when the hokey book title, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, far better expresses its openly greedy box office motives. One undeniable truth remains: attention must be paid. At just under 150 minutes, James Vanderbilt's Nuremberg, detailing the historic war trials for the surviving Nazis of World War II, moves along at an impressive clip. The meat of the film, the psychological face-offs between U.S. military psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, and unrepentant Nazi second-in-command Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, is deeply compelling. Göring is intimidating both physically, particularly in the way he fills the frame, and mentally. Crowe's carefully calculated combination of righteousness, fury, and narcissism makes for an especially complex and frightening performance. He presents a fascinating ethical quandary for Kelly, who seems to get worryingly close to Göring after hundreds of hours together. The tête-à-tête between Göring and Kelly delivers an enthralling moral dilemma in its reminder that the people who committed these atrocities were human beings. Though Nuremberg has a surprising sense of humor, including several amusing smash cuts, Vanderbilt is careful to give the weighty material the respect and space it deserves. That's particularly evident in the film's most harrowing scene, when the horrifying footage of the Holocaust is shown in the trial for the first time. Vanderbilt approaches the moment with utmost seriousness, cutting between the newsreel and people's devastated reactions to it. It's a crucial scene and the linchpin of Nuremberg, and Vanderbilt's careful, considerate direction makes it deeply moving. Occasionally, that balance between creating entertainment and delivering its message are at odds, as when a crucial showdown between prosecutor Robert Jackson, Michael Shannon, and Göring is deflated by one too many glib asides. It's a frustrating niggle. It's already a powerful moment without other characters reminding us how important it is, but mostly, Nuremberg delivers its message to great effect. The cast is uniformly impressive. It's Leo Woodall, as translator Howie Trieste, who walks away with the film, delivering a shattering monologue that won't leave a dry eye in the house. Nuremberg isn't the first, nor the best film about the Nuremberg trials. That'd be Stanley Kramer's tremendous Judgment at Nuremberg, from 1961. But it tackles familiar material with an intriguing new angle as it investigates the psychological elements of this moment in history, and is a worthy addition to the canon of films about one of the world's greatest tragedies. During the introduction at the world premiere of Nuremberg, director James Vanderbilt spoke of how he as a middle-aged man grew up with direct familial connections to the horrors of the Second World War. For those of his daughter's age, that period feels akin to the events the American Civil War, resonant, but in all practicality the stuff of the far past. With his latest film, he made it his mission to examine with contemporary attitudes the questions of wartime horror and transnational justice, all within the structure of a legal procedure with a psychologically complex edge. Rami Malek stars as Lt. Colonel Douglas Kelly, an army head shrinker tasked with ensuring the cabal of high-ranking Nazi officials are of right mind in order to be hanged. His principal subject is Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, a towering figure in the National Socialist movement, second only to Adolf Hitler in running the state for over a decade. Suave, charming, even gregarious, his almost aristocratic air and obvious charisma belies the horrors that he helped engineer. The very idea of a trial to hold these fallen leaders to legalistic account is presented as the brainchild of Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, a Supreme Court justice who, even before victory had been achieved, had floated the idea of a formal, international record of these acts of barbarity to formalize the record so that there would be no doubt in future generations about what occurred and by whom. The film plays in two interrelated modes: 1. The direct connection between doctor and patient trying to outmaneuver one another, and the other a courtroom drama with all the lack of nuance of a Perry Mason episode, complete with the gotcha moment that makes it all feel more procedural than profound. Based on the 2013 nonfiction book by Jack L. High, the film works best when it dives into the symbiotic relationship between a narcissistic patient of great intelligence and a perfidious psychiatrist with clear issues of his own. Crowe is at his best, having aged into character actor mode, and his prim and proper air with just a glint of malice behind the eyes is the film's greatest strength. It's not quite Hannibal Lecter levels of mixing charisma and diabolical malice, but it's closer than one might expect. The rest of the ensemble, including Richard E. Grant, John Slattery, Mark O'Brien, Colin Hanks, Lottie Verbeek, and Lydia Peckham, do their utmost to inject life into what are fairly two-dimensional roles on the page. Leo Woodall's SGT. Howie Trieste character, with a grand reveal telegraphed so often that its final utterance feels almost insulting to any audience awake when it occurs, provides a kind of wide-eyed view of the events which gives the film at least some of its emotional weight. Darius Wolski's lensing is often handsome, mixing dark ambers and cool shades of blue, and the production design effectively evokes the era of post-war Germany. Larger scenes of scope, such as the one taking place at a bombed-out Nuremberg stadium, suffer from feeling faked with the lighting never quite aligning, while the more intimate moments inside the prison or the various houses are far more effectively realized. This all brings to the fore the central problem with the film that may, for many, be cause to dismiss it entirely. The complex Nuremberg trials involved thousands of documents, hundreds of witnesses, numerous lawyers, and various investigative methods, employing the Germans' own voluminous records as the basis for factual claims. This may be the reality of the trials, but also boring for audiences wanting something a bit more digestible. Thus, some may well be justifiably annoyed by the dumbing down of these critical events of global history just to fit into a convenient feature film running time. Worse, the importance of the central character is amplified for another hook into a story often told, making Kelly's role in some ways elevated and in other ways diminished, all to suit the film rather than the historical record. This leads to a core complication arising from Vanderbilt's plea during the film's intro. For all its bold moments of courtroom antics and mind games between monsters and their keepers, this is an almost insultingly pared-down version of events from one of the most important legalistic moments in human history. By providing a convenient in within a broader entertainment, the film certainly introduces newer generations to what transpired, but it provides such a simplified view that it may actually do more harm than good. The ends justifies the means aspect of the prosecutor's actions, without the appropriate nuance of thought being exercised, will allow many to feel that the entire legal strategy was a cover for decisions already made, a mere facade to protect the honor of those who wrap the rope around the necks of their fallen foes. The film does lip service to these larger issues, and one has to actively ignore the niggling reminders that the whole thing is almost childish in its simplifications and see it as a compelling drama set during heightened times. The most powerful part of Nuremberg is the archival footage played at length. We see the map showing the hundreds of camps, the the bodies captured on film stacked like cordwood, and skeletal figured with gaping eyes from the labor camps shown to many for the first time at these legal proceedings. These were trials that proved, through all the mechanisms of truth-telling that modern society can provide, that these events happened, they were perpetrated by these men, and that they should pay for their crimes. And then there's the final element that's exposed in inelegant and yet impactful ways. Namely, that the Nazis were not another species of human, and their actions were not unique to this one place or one country. To shoot them against the wall and declare them monsters would be the easy thing to do at the end of the war. The hard part was to allow them to tell their stories, and show the poison at the heart of their actions that were anything but supernatural. As Trieste points out, the easiest would be to otherize this evil, just as the Nazis dehumanized those thrust into the camps. As the trial proved, and the film illustrates, the enemies to peace and compassion aren't devils, they're people, just as we are, making their actions that much more abhorrent. The prevention of the rise of similar evil is an unending project needing similar vigilance and tenacity as expressed by many of those captured here on screen in Nuremberg. Given that Stanley Kramer's 1961 masterpiece Judgment at Nuremberg is widely regarded to be one of the greatest courtroom dramas of all time, it seemed unusual for a new film to tackle the same subject material. Even though the Nuremberg trials were among the most important proceedings of the 20th century and are of particular relevance today, Kramer's film was so all-encompassing in its scope of perspectives that it offered the final word on the critical military tribunals that were concluded in 1946. However, the Nuremberg case marked an unprecedented inflection point of international law, war crime identification, ethnic tensions, and cultural rot that involved multiple parties, and more than a few remarkable individuals. Nuremberg is an ambitious attempt to encapsulate them all. While it may be a bit overreaching at times, James Vanderbilt's second directorial effort touches on many of the most important takeaways and is often quite moving. Nuremberg presents the impossible burden placed upon the prosecutors tasked with trying to former member of the Nazi High Command, who they intend to prove committed genocide during the Holocaust. Given that a nation does not typically judge other governments, the Nuremberg court consists of representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The American Associate Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, knows that the trial's success is dependent on the testimony of Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, the right-hand man to Adolf Hitler, who tasked his subordinates with mapping out the final solution. In order to crack someone who has proven impenetrable to interrogation, Jackson enlists the assistance of the psychiatrist Douglas Kenney, Rami Malek, to interview both Göring and the other captured Nazis. Setting a majority of the film before the trial itself not only allows Nuremberg to avoid comparisons with the aforementioned Kramer film, but gives an opportunity to show the unusual discourse that emerged in the aftermath of the largest-scale conflict in world history. The exact details of the Holocaust were ambiguous to many onlookers, and there were some sympathies with German military leaders whose efforts were described as patriotic, not genocidal. The pressure put upon Jackson, Kenney, and Colonel Burton C. Andrus, John Slattery, was not only to implement justice, but to change the narrative on a global stage. There's a scattershot of perspectives incorporated throughout Nuremberg in an effort to show the different roles that were played in the trials, and for the most part, the film is nimble in spreading its attention. While the focus is often strained, a film about such a seismic event does not necessarily require a single point of view character, and its 148-minute running time does not feel overbearing. Of all the secondary figures depicted, Leo Woodall is captivating as Sergeant Howie Trieste, a former German refugee who fought on the side of the Allies after concealing his Jewish heritage. Woodall knows how to play the subtlety of the moment, and he's given one stellar monologue that encapsulates the pain, rage, and trauma of his experiences. Malek's role in the story is unusual but interesting as a non-traditional way to hook a potential audience. Kenney is such a good reader of behavior that he finds engaging in a battle of wits to be stimulating, as he is able to find the humanity within any of his subjects. While the introduction to Kenney implies that Nuremberg will be a far more rousing, restorative epic than it ends up being, Malek effectively conveys the paranoia and frustration that the psychiatrist felt when realizing how out of depth he is. Nuremberg doesn't quite stick the landing in giving closure to Kenny's story, but Malek's performance is never less than riveting. Nuremberg walks a very fine line in attempting to humanize Göring, but its ability to explain his rationale makes the weight of his atrocities even more horrifying. Göring's ability is to appear to be a patriotic admirer of his country's history who saw an opportunity to take pride in his German heritage while supporting a family, but the degree of his hatred is revealed when he's forced to admit culpability. Crowe, who has spent the last decade in mostly forgettable roles, offers a reminder as to why he was once considered one of the greatest actors in the world. There's a ridiculous, pompous sense of dignity to Göring that makes him so dangerous, as the fear lies in whether he could incite a new wave of support for Hitler's rhetoric. Nuremberg doesn't directly tie itself to contemporary politics, but there are more than enough allusions to the harmful silence that could lead to a resurgence of anti-Semitism, fascism, and genocide. Nuremberg succeeds in examining aspects of the post-war political framework that have yet to be detailed in full by other World War II dramas, including the legal parameters of the final solution and the role played by the Catholic Church. It's due to the expansive scope that it doesn't feel entirely derivative when Nuremberg essentially replicates a scene from Judgment at Nuremberg, in which members of the court bear witness to the first unveiling of footage from concentration camps. It should go without saying that the footage is devastating, upsetting, and almost inconceivable in its cruelty. While the use of such well-documented archive material could have been an easy card for Nuremberg to pull, Vanderbilt is able to hang within the abject horror of the moment. Although it eventually adds more pressure to Jackson's mission, the scene itself is appropriately somber and allows each character to express their feelings. It's one of the best scenes of the year. Nuremberg finds a compelling way to approach the trials themselves that emphasize the importance of showing what role Göring played alongside the other architects of the final solution, and gives the film as momentous a conclusion as it could ask for. Although this results in a situation in which some character arcs are abruptly rushed or cut off momentarily, Nuremberg is able to showcase the embittered attitudes brought upon by the ruling. Despite setting an important precedent, it didn't even begin to heal the magnitude of atrocities that would ripple for generations. Vanderbilt, who has an unusual filmography, delivers his best script since Zodiac, and executes a much stronger directorial vision than his underwhelming debut, Truth. Nuremberg won't go down as one of the definitive World War II films or even one of the most memorable courtroom dramas of recent years, but it's an effective history lesson with important implications. Russell Crowe and Rami Malek face off in an historical battle of wits and Weltanschauung in James Vanderbilt's new film Nuremberg. The movie comes to cinemas to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the first international trials of the Nazis in the fall of 1945. Based on Jack Elhay's 2013 book about the fateful encounter between the Berkeley psychiatrist Douglas Kelly and Hitler's second-in-command and the highest-ranking Nazi to be put on trial by the Allies, Hermann Göring, the story revolves around Kelly's assignment to ensure that the defendants at Nuremberg were fit to stand trial, and charts his complex personal relationship with Göring up until he takes the stand. Vanderbilt's film runs to just shy of 2.5 hours, with the trial itself appearing about halfway through. This would not be such a noteworthy observation were it not that the pacing and tone of the production were so uneven. The first half of the film feels very slow and plodding. To compensate, one cannot help but feel that in an attempt to engage the viewer, Vanderbilt's production trips over itself. The story is often burdened with tin-eared asides, misjudged contrivances, and jarring use of voice-over. Similarly, the slapstick technicolored home movie backstory of Nazi leader Rudolf Hess crashing a decidedly modern Cessna into the Scottish Highlands like a Nazi Dorothy in the Land of Oz feels very off-beam. There are running gags, some of which pay off, and others which just don't. There are ideas that do work. The trope of the magician's sleight of hand has a glorious and inventive payoff. But the tongue-in-cheek reprise of Crowe in Gladiator leading his war criminals down the tunnel into the courtroom is of questionable taste to say the least. Such inglorious bastardizations don't sit well with the actual footage of the camps shown subsequently. Notwithstanding, the film has an undeniably stellar cast, and Michael Shannon and Richard E. Grant fill the screen with riveting performances in the courtroom as prosecutors. Crowe is best when he is given the opportunity to show complex emotion beyond a lispy German-accented braggadocio, and Malek shines when he lets his psychiatrist unleash the heady mix of impotent and righteous anger that would be his eventual undoing. Correspondingly, when the two men are given the opportunity, their chemistry is scintillating. Sadly, set UPS around this intense Hughes class are often labored, with storylines that fizzle out and characters who become suddenly pivotal and then recede into the background. Perhaps most frustrating is the brevity of the epilogue, which skips over the last lonely years of Douglas Kelly's life after the trial. A stunning reveal about what became of Kelly's life merits more than some cursory text tagged on before the end credits. Rami Malek has incredible range, and a more nuanced film charting his descent into a pariah and Cassandra figure deserved so much more. For a film about the battle of minds to gloss over the tragic denouement seems like a missed opportunity for a drama that deserved to have the psychological depth and courage of its convictions. That the film seems to be stylistically uneven may be in no small part due to the weight of the thematic engagements it attempts to bring to the fore. Long before any such trials took place, there was a question looming over the public discourse that persists to this day about the nature of evil and mass psychology. It is a fateful question addressed by Vanderbilt's film when it is at its most convincing. Do those who commit crimes against humanity forfeit their own? The entreaty is as virulent as it is insistent. It appears in questions about whether judging such crimes is legitimate at all, and extends to the very idea of what it means to be sane and responsible for such genocidal abominations. The U.S. prosecution chose to turn down offers, including by then General Dwight D. Eisenhower, to stand in the witness box in favor of a spectacular move, showing a specially compiled documentary, a devastating expose of the crimes of the Holocaust, as Exhibit 230. At Nuremberg, the courtroom-turned-cinema screened the visceral barbarism of the concentration camps to a horrified world watching the proceedings. Vanderbilt paces the sequence well. Elhai writes in his book that after watching the footage of murder, unspeakable abjection, and slaughter, Goering is said to have remarked, "It was all going so well, and then they showed that awful film." The hubris and the delusion in this one throwaway remark exposing Goering as a man totally bereft of empathy and coldly aware of his complicity do not make it to Vanderbilt's film. Crowe's Goering simply dismisses the evidence as fake news. Rather, Nuremberg builds to a showdown on the stand, trapping him, with Kelly's help, into declaring his unwavering fealty to Hitler beyond the grave. While it may serve a story about a maverick genius psychiatrist and a floundering prosecutor, this construct of Goering as a man of enormous legal intellect and demagogic prowess seems all too crudely established and easily dismantled when the time comes. Vanderbilt's film arrives at theaters as the latest in a long line of films made about the trials of Nazi war crimes. It would be hard to follow such earth-shattering performances by Maximilian Schell and Spencer Tracy in 1961's Judgment at Nuremberg, as well as Brian Cox's excoriating presence as Goering in Yves Simoneau's 2000 miniseries Nuremberg. The film also appears in the age of social media psychology, within a cacophony of diagnostic terminology, using, for example, the term narcissist in his script, eliciting mental images of talking heads on podcasts and reels on the phone, where the mere mention of the word Nazi a decade ago might have provided sufficient abhorrence. The moral abnegations of the Holocaust on show at the trial seem to demand an explanation beyond the moral scope of what it is to be rational. With crimes so abject, some were tempted then, as now, to conclude that the only bearable accounting of these criminals must be in the realms of the demonic, the otherworldly. These were not the conclusions of Douglas Kelly, in his book published after the trials or in this film. Kelly saw Goering and the Nazis ultimately as quite ordinary men, and most damningly, he found that he shared certain personality traits with them. Rather than find the extraordinary in their pasts to explain their crimes, he was forced to conclude that no such demonic forces or cataclysmic motives need exist. Writing about Adolf Eichmann's 1961 trial in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt would famously remark that she saw the banality of evil in the pinched figure standing behind bulletproof glass at court. The genocidal evil of the Nazis was, and is, often accorded a type of genius, an idea that often persists in public discourse as a way to account for the sheer malice in the planning and execution of the Holocaust as something exceptional. Because to accept Douglas Kelly's conclusions that the capacity for the most unspeakable atrocity is latent in our own reality is shockingly quotidian and perhaps too frightening to hear, a responsibility too terrible to accept and yet too prescient to ignore. Nuremberg, written and directed by James Vanderbilt, is the latest retelling of the events following the end of the Second World War, when the major world powers confronted the full magnitude of the Nazis' horrific crimes. Based on the book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist by Jack L. High, it looks at the trials from the perspective of Army psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, who was brought in to observe and study the defendants, including, most notably, Hitler's former number 2 and the most senior Nazi still left alive, Hermann Göring. While previous dramatizations attempted to look at the trials as a whole, or, in the case of Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, retold events using fictional characters, this new version focuses almost entirely on the interactions between Göring, Russell Crowe, and Kelly, Rami Malek, playing out almost as a Silence of the Lambs-esque thriller, as they each attempt to play the other. Over the course of the film, we see Kelly gradually becoming more unsure of himself as he slowly develops a relationship, and even a friendship, with the high-ranking Nazi. This angle is arguably the biggest strength of the film, yet also the most obvious issue with it. Crowe has already won widespread praise for his performance as Göring. He provides the character with a genuine charm and likability, and the scenes in which we see his more vulnerable side, or where we meet his seemingly sweet and normal family, help to create a genuine sense of complexity about the character that mirrors Kelly's own inner conflict. At the same time, however, the choice to focus almost entirely on this dynamic means that many of the other individuals involved are treated largely as an afterthought. The film perhaps leans too much into trying to present these events as if it were in fact a thriller, with Göring presented as some kind of mastermind who might genuinely walk free, as opposed to it largely just being a question of whether or not he'd get the rope. The trial itself actually ends up being condensed to just a couple of scenes that feel highly simplified, to the point where the entire verdict seems to rest on a few brief exchanges, the switch from the prosecution's apparent defeat to their then winning the day taking place in the space of several minutes, on the basis of just one issue. Malek's character, and the insights he gained into Göring's psychology, are portrayed as far more crucial to the outcome of the case than in reality. There are a number of exchanges that feel quite contrived, and indeed, very Hollywood, as Kelly goes from initial arrogance, to apparent defeat, then to a moment of sudden motivation after the importance of the trial is brought home to him. Meanwhile, the case is portrayed as one that entirely begins and ends with Göring and his fate. A couple of the other defendants, such as Julius Streicher and Rudolf Hess, are depicted, but only briefly, whilst other major defendants such as Rudolf Höss or Albert Speer, the one who arguably did get away with it, are entirely left out of the narrative. The film is one that is often also prone to moments that feel cliched or predictable, the Jewish army officer who states he smoke after the war is done and then finally pulls out a cigarette at the close of the film, or the judge who, for some reason, feels he can only hammer home his point about the evils of the Nazis by taking Kelly in the middle of the night to the site of Hitler's rallies. These all stand out as scenes where one can practically feel the screenwriter typing away behind them. The film still has plenty of moments that are undeniably powerful. The cast almost all impress, with particularly memorable turns from Michael Shannon and Richard E. Grant as the two chief prosecutors. Like Judgment at Nuremberg, the film also does not hold back from showing actual footage from the concentration camps, footage that remains just as shocking when watched back now. But it's perhaps precisely because of content like this that other scenes feel that bit more obvious in their artifice. Having to witness heaps of bodies and emaciated prisoners in one scene only makes it stand out all the more when, for much of the rest of the film, we get heavy-handed dialogue that feels like it's come straight out of a Marvel movie. Ultimately, the film is one that feels as if it's been made on the assumption that its audience are themselves largely ignorant about much of what happened, spelling things out in a way that does not feel natural, and which too often simplifies the actual individuals and events depicted. The message it ends on, that this can happen again, and that we wouldn't necessarily recognize it because the perpetrators won't be wearing the same scary uniforms, is an important one that unfortunately feels all too timely, but, as with much of the rest of the film, is something that is just outright stated by the characters in question, rather than something that feels earned, or is naturally built up to. James Vanderbilt's depiction of the Nuremberg trials focuses on a fascinating new side to the events in question, with its more personal focus on the relationship between Kelly and Goring. Crowe in particular deserves praise for what is a brilliant, layered performance. However, the film exaggerates the importance of this dynamic and simplifies much else that took place, with some clumsy dialogue and moments that don't land as they should. The Nuremberg trials have inspired filmmakers before, from Stanley Kramer's 1961 drama to the 2000 television miniseries with Alec Baldwin and Brian Cox. But for the latest take, Nuremberg, writer-director James Vanderbilt focuses on a lesser-known figure, the U.S. Army psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, who after the war was assigned to supervise and evaluate captured Nazi leaders to ensure they were fit for trial, and also keep them alive. But his is a name that had been largely forgotten. He wasn't even a character in the miniseries. Kelly, portrayed in the film by Rami Malek, was an ambitious sort who saw in this assignment an opportunity to write a book, best-selling, he hoped, on his findings about the men who committed such atrocities. Over several months he conducted many hours interviews and Rorschach tests with the inmates, including fallen Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, Russell Crowe, who proved an especially fascinating subject as the highest-ranking official still living. The film, in theaters Friday, centers on a series of conversations between Kelly and Goering, who develop something almost like a friendship or at least a temporary understanding. It's interesting, morally murky territory fitting of the filmmaker best known as the screenwriter of Zodiac that does gesture toward some provocative ideas, including the very concept of war tribunals overseen by the victors. But it can't quite synthesize its classical form with the bleak, sobering truths at its core. Crowe, who speaks both German and English in the film, is well suited to playing this charismatic, larger-than-life egoist who believes he can outwit those around him. Curious choices are made, though, about what to tell of his transgressions during the war and the angelic representation of his wife and daughter in hiding. Goering is likely not as much of a household name as Nuremberg seems to assume, but Crowe does get to do some of his best work in years. Malek, wild-eyed as ever, portrays Kelly as an overconfident opportunist who is more than willing to cross lines to gain Goering's trust. Are we rooting for him, though? Not exactly. You might think that these chats would be the kinds you don't want to leave a meeting of two unique minds trying to figure one another out, and yet there's a spark and intrigue lacking. An unnerving descent into the mind of Hitler's right-hand man this is not. Instead, they talk about fathers and greatness and sometimes magic tricks. Perhaps that's why Vanderbilt, who based his film on Jack L. High's book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, broadens his scope beyond the prison cell to include the story of how the unprecedented trial came together, with Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, a very good Michael Shannon, leading the charge to build a case against the Nazi leaders. What results is a familiar historical drama, weaving together many various characters in the build-up to the climactic courtroom showdown. With an expansive and recognizable ensemble cast, including Richard E. Grant as the British lawyer Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, John Slattery as the commandant of Nuremberg prison, Colin Hanks as another psychiatrist brought into the fold, Gustav Gilbert, whose writings would eclipse Kelly's, and Leo Woodall as a German-speaking U.S. officer. Nuremberg, stately and sober, is what we might have called Oscar bait once upon a time. The most fascinating character is probably Woodall's, but the real story of SGT. Howie Trieste, a German Jewish émigré, is used as a reveal late in the film to motivate a humiliated Kelly to do the right thing and help Jackson and the lawyers bring Goring to justice. Oddly, the trial is filmed like a standard courtroom drama, resorting to cliches and a rousing but hollow "we got him" moment that feels antithetical to the film's larger point, that there is little glory in the charade and the convictions. At the end of it all is death anyway. What does it say about a nearly 2.5-hour drama when the 80-year-old footage from inside Nazi concentration camps that was shown inside the real courtroom is the most compelling and memorable sequence? Perhaps in these days of Holocaust denial, it's never a bad idea to remind people of the truth. But will anyone harboring those assumptions stumble upon Nuremberg and, if they do, make it that far into the film? Kelly would go on to write that book, 22 Cells in Nuremberg, but his chilling conclusions were not exactly embraced in that post-war moment. He did not find monsters or psychopaths in those cells, after all, but instead saw essentially normal people. Kelly wrote a warning, "I am convinced that there is little in America today which could prevent the establishment of a Nazi-like state." Nuremberg, a Sony Pictures Classics release in theaters Friday, is rated PG-13 by the Motion Picture Association for the Holocaust, some language, violent content, smoking, brief drug content, some disturbing images, suicide. 148 minutes. 2.5 stars out of 4. In his introductory scene in the new English film Nuremberg, Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, is shown to be carrying out a card trick in a moving train much to the awe of his female co-passenger. Kelly is a psychiatrist who is assigned duties to take care of the mental health of the Nazi prisoners, while he secretly beholds an ambition of writing a book on the same, something that would make him famous. In a separate scene, you see Kelly interacting with Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, in the latter's cell, wherein Göring sighs on how he intends to play a magic trick at the time of his trial. Göring is the first man in command of the declining Nazi Empire, and probably the last of the surviving prisoners after the death of Adolf Hitler. He is charming and courteous with a hint of humor that you see him sport right at the start, wherein he and his family are captured, even as you see him pointing towards his luggage in a bid to tell his opponents to carry it for him. Interesting, the drama here exists between these magical tricks of both the characters, doubling up as a compelling drama that upholds the distinction between right and wrong, and justice and accountability. Based on the book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist by Jack L. High and adapted by James Vanderbilt, Nuremberg has a historical significance of its own, particularly as a reactionary follow-up of the events that had transpired in the Hitler era with respect to the concentration camps that saw the death of 500,000 Jews. In that regard, the politics of the drama is set straight up at the start with the capture of Göring and his subordinates, triggering a chain of events that coaxes many nations to join hands in a bid for justice. One such inclusion remains that of Justice Robert Jackson, Michael Shannon, who along with a representative of lawyers from each country, is asked to present an argument of proving the guilt of the Nazi prisoners. And what could have been a direct verdict on their war crimes is deviated into a fair trial, given how Jackson feels that none of them must die a martyr and that it is imperative to show the world through a fair trial that humanity still exists, and the same mistakes aren't committed in the shifting power dynamics in play. And yet, much of the courtroom scenes in the first hour are reduced in the background even with respect to the politics in play, as the focus lies on the budding dynamic between Kelly and Göring. On the surface of it, this may seem like a bromance even as Kelly warms up to the charm of Göring, minutely standing up to the atrocities that are committed to him, while also volunteering to visit Göring's family comprising of his wife and daughter and carrying out their handwritten letters to him. Given that the drama does unfold through the gaze of Kelly, you see him enamored by Göring's wit and charm, be it the latter pretending to not know the English language and in the process, outwitting fellow soldier SGT Howie Trieste, Leo Woodall, or even assuming him to be a family man caught in a crossfire between his duties and actual thoughts. In multiple moments, you see Kelly going out of his way to help Göring, while also developing a close proximity to the latter's family. It is interesting on how the picture changes when you choose to look at the subtext of the drama, and equate it to the political climate of the globe currently. The underlying trait is that of manipulation, something that is synonymous with so many world leaders in today's times. Most of them wish to create a public image of innocence while heavily manipulating the mob in their favor, even as their reality remains drastically different. In that sense, Kelly finds himself at the receiving end of Goring's moves, trying to empathize with his situation and taking his case up against his own people. It is interesting how the lines of morality for Kelly are blurred even from a seemingly neutral stance, that in turn would have psychological implications to his personality, later on in his life. The drama scores heavily during the courtroom sequences, while intercutting real-life footages in a docudrama style of narrative. Here, the actual footage of the concentration camps involving clamps of dead bodies scooped from the ground will make you squirm in your seat, the appearance of malnutritioned wiry bodies will churn your gut. And all of it has a vital significance in order to blur your own morality too, just like Kelly, who would continue to defend Goring. For the latter, it isn't about owning up any responsibility for his supposed actions, or alternately, even projecting himself as a martyr, even with an ideology of Hitler making Germany feel like home again. If you were to draw parallels to the current political setup, you would know what a frightening thought this is, just like Jackson, who believed Germany to crawl out of WWI and later turn up to be powerful in World War II, while being firm on his stance on how the world cannot afford another World War III in the coming years. In that regard, the narrative also does distinguish between right and wrong through its characters, even while accounting for its emotional core to seep in with respect to the character of Howie and his backstory. These arguments bear a resounding impact on the skewed psychology of Kelly, even as he wishes to send out the global message of autocracy to the world while putting his own country at a pedestal too. And outside the trials and the ultimate fate of the characters, you do realize that the world we live in today is eerily similar to the Nazi era, be it the slaughter of residents of Gaza or the erstwhile Syrian crisis, all dictated by nations that are powerful. The dictatorship is in full swing, at times even in the face of democracy in a few countries, making me realize on how humanity hasn't learned a thing from the past in the wake of the power dynamics doing the rounds. The dialogues are conversational and, quite honestly, define the fabric of the drama here. The skewed sense of morality is extended even to the viewers before allowing space for a searing viewing arc that clearly distinguishes the lines of morality while allowing you space to ponder on. The BGM is subtle and sparingly used, often relying on the silence to transport you in the vicinity of the atmospherics of the drama. The cinematography comprises of tight frames that allow you to invest in the varied psyche of a few of the characters, while empathizing and skewing your sense of morality along the way. But the real deal lies in the utilization of actual footage from the Nazi era, that is gut-wrenching and quite uncomfortable to witness on screen. The editing pattern is leisurely, in a good way, allowing the conversations to brew without incorporating any jump cuts. And that also remains a prime contributing factor that adds a consistent flavor to the proceedings without any sudden spikes. Director James Vanderbilt does a wonderful job in tactfully constructing a drama that acts as a mirror to the current times. His world building and characterization remains on point even while deliberately skewing the inherent morality of his characters, only while bringing in a sense of realization later on. This makes for an effective narrative style that makes for a compelling watch, wherein the director does his bit in giving a glimpse into the psyche of his characters and some important historical figures, at times with terrifying and scarring after effects. The performances are immaculate by the members of the cast. Ren Schmidt as Elsie and Mark O'Brien as John have their moments to shine. John M. Slattery as Burton is wonderful to witness while subtly contributing to bouts of humor in a few instances in the drama. Leo Woodall as SGT Howie contributes to the emotional core of the drama with a painful backstory that touches you, while making you empathetic towards him. Michael Shannon as Robert Jackson delivers a towering act of the highest order in a powerful yet vulnerable performance that lights up the courtroom scenes, simply with his urgency and his presence. Russell Crowe as Herman Gosing is incredibly good here, using his charm and wit to great effect. His body language is measured even as his performance had so much to do with his core trait of manipulation, something that he pulls off with aplomb. He is terrific here and puts forth an excellent performance. Rami Malek as Douglas Kelly is a vulnerable character who witnesses his morality being skewed. In that regard, Malek uses his posture to great effect in communicating his vulnerable side, deftly digging into his fragile psyche while soon being on a path of realization. There is an undercurrent of restraint that drives his character arc with lingering scars to boast of, and he does a fine job here. If the Nuremberg trials were political theater, writer and director James Vanderbilt leans into the spectacle of it. His new movie Nuremberg, about the show put on for the rest of the world to indict Nazi war criminals, is packaged like old-fashioned entertainment. There are movie stars, chiefly Rami Malek and Russell Crowe, with slicked back hair, trading snappy barbs and self-important monologues in smoky rooms. Meanwhile, the gravity of the moment tends to be kept at bay. All the bureaucratic and legal speak around fine-tuning an unprecedented process, where one country prosecutes the high command of another, goes down easy in an Aaron Sorkin sort of way. It is riveting when its urgency is defended by an actor as great as Michael Shannon. It is also watchable, to a fault, especially when dealing with the unspeakable. There's some rhyme and reason to the director's approach. Vanderbilt, who wrote the screenplay for David Fincher's Zodiac, a masterpiece about the impossible pursuit for truth, has made a movie about two figures so narcissistic, opportunistic, and caught up in the showmanship that they leave very little room for the gravity of the moment to sink in. Malek plays Douglas M. Kelly, the psychiatrist tasked with monitoring the indicted prisoners' mental health, just to make sure they don't kill themselves before they stand trial. We meet him confidently flirting with a woman on a train, playing card tricks to show off his ability to read and misdirect his opponents. Crowe, often shot to fill the frame, plays Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, deemed the second most powerful man in Germany. He's introduced in an opening that quickly goes from clever to flippant, where on-screen text announces that Adolf Hitler is dead and 70 million have perished in the war. In one take we watch as migrants move on foot through an Austrian wasteland, a road to where would be the question, and a soldier relieves himself on the swastika painted on a bombed-out Nazi vehicle. In comes Crowe's Göring, chauffeured in a limousine, surrendering to the Allied forces by commanding they take his luggage. Crowe is one of the few people on screen who can manage the comic relief without undercutting the weight of his character, whatever humor or witticisms Göring dishes out laced with calculated malevolence. Much of Nuremberg hangs on the scenery chewing between Kelly and Göring during casual therapy sessions, where both seem to bond over their shared affinity for gamesmanship, while ultimately pursuing their own claim to infamy. Göring is gearing up for a trial where he can reinforce the Nazi ideals he still stands by, and go down as a martyr if he must, while taking no responsibility for the Holocaust. Kelly can't wait to write a book on what goes on in the minds of Nazis. Spoiler alert, the fruit of Kelly's labor is called 22 Cells in Nuremberg. In his review of the 1947 book's assessments, about how Nazi psychology could not only influence those abroad but was in part fostered by the West, Frederick Wortham writes, there is little in America today which could prevent the establishment of a Nazi-like state. Vanderbilt's Nuremberg hammers down on that argument, and its relevance today, with Crowe's Göring echoing a familiar slogan when he says Hitler made us feel German again. The point Vanderbilt perhaps unintentionally skirts, is how ultimately hollow the spectacle at Nuremberg can feel, not just in his movie, but since prosecuting war crimes and establishing international law has done nothing to prevent the atrocities in Gaza. That sort of realness never cracks through the polished surfaces in Vanderbilt's Nuremberg, which is too often seduced by the spectacle it should be more critical of. The movie reduces Kelly's psychiatric insights into sound bites, manages to whittle down the proceedings at the Nuremberg trials into the familiar tropes and clichés from classic courtroom movies, and even lets Crowe's performance surrender its nuances to hammy villainy, all for the sake of reliable entertainment. A pivotal point in Nuremberg arrives during the trial, when prosecutors show shocking and horrifying footage filled with emaciated, mutilated, and decaying bodies at concentration camps. Vanderbilt opts to show the real footage. But instead of ushering in the gravity this movie keeps at a distance for so long, the authentic material only highlights how artificial everything surrounding it really is. There are more zingers than you'd expect in Nuremberg, which dramatizes the trial of Nazi commander Hermann Göring. Stretches of it, in fact, are paced like we're chasing the downfall of crafty mobsters rather than the architects of the unthinkable. Various high-ranking members of the party are introduced with the zap-pow of newspaper headlines, technical recreations, and salacious details. Robert Ley was captured in his pajamas, didn't you know? It makes sense, in part, for the story being told here. Yet Nuremberg can ultimately only justify its Hollywood sheen for so long. The film's written and directed by James Vanderbilt, behind the screenplays for both David Fincher's Zodiac, 2007, and the Adam Sandler Jennifer Aniston murder mystery comedies, and he draws here mostly from Jack Elhay's 2013 nonfiction book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. The Nazi in question is Göring, Russell Crowe. The psychiatrist is Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, brought in to ensure the imprisoned Nazi high command don't kill themselves before they can stand trial. Kelly has a bigger picture in mind. If he can dissect evil, slap a label on the psychological dysfunction that drives these men to barbarity, then he'll have a bestseller on his hands. Crowe and Malek are well cast for this kind of dance. The former is a battering ram of an on-screen presence, mixed here with an unnerving sense of comfort in his surroundings. At one point, we see him lounging on his prison cell mattress like he's expecting to be hand-fed grapes. Malek, meanwhile, can do a slippier, quieter charm, a smile with 1,000 lines of code doing the analysis behind it. And while it's a little much to follow the line, "Who's bigger than the president?" with a comedy smash cut to the Vatican, the form at least fits the function. The Allies have freshly won the war, and while there are whispers of what's gone on in the so-called labor camps, these men all wear the thrill of victory on their breasts. But, while lawyers Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, and David Maxwell Fyfe, Richard E. Grant, postulate about righteous justice, all while Brian Tyler's score rallies them onward, you're quietly waiting for the curtain to draw back and the mouth of hell itself to be revealed. When it does, Vanderbilt presents it starkly and truthfully, in the same way Stanley Kramer did in 1961's Judgment at Nuremberg, by showing the audience real footage captured by American and British soldiers after the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. For a few moments, everything stills. All we hear is the whir of the projector. All we see is the horror. Kelly's pristine world, built out of the lies he swallowed so he could sit across from Göring each day and talk to him like an associate, or maybe even a friend, collapses in an instant. And yet, the film doesn't follow where he goes. Soon enough, we're back in safe, old Hollywood world, with a declaration nearly to camera that we might as well go finish the war. Nuremberg's closing titles reveal how much Kelly was truly affected by the trials, in his fears that all these promises that only the rule of the law can break the terrible cycles of history were for naught, or that the perpetrators of genocide and slaughter possess some unique quality unseen in their fellow man. What should represent the soul of this film is merely its coda. While it pleads for us to reckon with the ugliest of truths, it shuts the curtains before its own reckoning is done. Dir. James Vanderbilt. Starring Russell Crowe, Rami Malek, Leo Woodall, John Slattery, Mark O'Brien, Colin Hanks, Ren Schmidt, Lydia Peckham, Richard E. Grant, Michael Shannon. Cert 15, 148 minutes. What should represent the soul of this film is merely its coda. While it pleads for us to reckon with the ugliest of truths, it shuts the curtains before its own reckoning is done. Dir. James Vanderbilt. Starring Russell Crowe, Rami Malek, Leo Woodall, John Slattery, Mark O'Brien, Colin Hanks, Ren Schmidt, Lydia Peckham, Richard E. Grant, Michael Shannon. Cert 15, 148 minutes. Directed and written by James Vanderbilt, Nuremberg opens a few days after Hitler's death in 1945. Hermann Göring, Russell Crowe, president of the Reichstag for the Nazi regime and Hitler's second-in-command, surrenders to the US Army in the opening scene. From there, he and 21 other Nazi officials are taken to Nuremberg, Germany, where American Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, Michael Shannon, intends to try them for war crimes. We are then introduced to Douglas Kelly, Rami Malek, a psychiatrist assigned to maintaining the mental health of the prisoners before the trial, but who is mostly there to write a hopefully lucrative book about the experience and maybe charm a beautiful woman or two with some slick talk and card tricks. So begins Nuremberg, less a movie about the trial itself, although the trial is featured in the back half, so much as it is about the push and pull between Kelly and Göring, who develop a strange bond as Kelly tries to understand what makes Göring tick. The film places the burden of its moral dilemmas on Kelly, who has to weigh his own ambitions and growing fascination with Göring against the altruism espoused by Leo Woodall's Sergeant Howie Trieste, the translator assigned to help Kelly, and also pressure from Jackson to break doctor-patient confidentiality by providing information on Göring's legal defense strategy to the Allied prosecutors. At the same time, Kelly's attempts to get deeper in with Göring lead him to becoming the man's main connection with the outside world, including his wife and daughter, whose treatment by US forces later in the film reminds Kelly that his country is not above the tactics used by their enemies. When approaching these story threads with the gravity they deserve, Nuremberg is mostly successful as a drama. But the movie doesn't make the best first impression, with the opening act littered with ill-conceived jokes and dialogue that veers a bit too close to contemporary irony. Not that movies about heavy subject matter can't have the occasional dose of humor in them. There is one particular location switch in Nuremberg that is both an excellent bit of editing and the best gag in the film, but the film's early reliance on levity comes off like the filmmakers are worried modern audiences won't pay attention to a historical epic if they aren't coaxed into it with treats. It's a creative choice that betrays the film's dramatic intentions and hurts its narrative credibility, but it's a tendency the film thankfully moves away from as it heads into its later acts. What helps keep the movie above water is a deep bench of solid actors. Crowe strikes exactly the right tone for Göring, played as something between Hannibal Lecter and Crowe's own take on Dr. Jekyll from the 2017 Mummy movie. That sounds cartoonish, and it sometimes is, but Crowe keeps Göring compelling even when teetering on the edge of caricature, never letting us forget that beneath the smiles and occasional antics lies a sharp analytical mind who oversaw numerous crimes against humanity. Vanderbilt fills his supporting roles with a strong collection of names, including Shannon, John Slattery, and Richard E. Grant, all of whom prove to be as dependable as ever. Special mention has to go to Woodall, who gets one of the film's best scenes at a train station late in the film that serves to cement Nuremberg's emotional core. The question mark is Malek, who is not bad in the film so much as slightly outclassed by the group surrounding him. His facial expressions and line deliveries don't always match the tone of a given scene, with many of the aforementioned moments of contemporary irony falling on his shoulders. He sometimes can't help but feel like a man from a 21st century movie airdropped into the 1940s. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but his performance and the writing of his character, the fact that he's also a magician is seemingly only there to provide a Chekhov's skill for Göring to learn in time for the finale, doesn't always work in tandem with the film's dramatic aims. But he does serve as Vanderbilt's mouthpiece at the end, where the filmmaker plainly states that the Nazis were not a unique type of evil, but instead proponents of the exact kind of ideologies that can and have suited imperial interests in nations all over the world. It's not a new concept, and I would argue that Stanley Kramer's excellent 1961 film Judgment at Nuremberg was a better take on both that idea and the trials at large, but Vanderbilt's film is a worthwhile watch all the same. This film, directed by James Vanderbilt, screenplay by James Vanderbilt, based on The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, produced by Richard Saperstein, starring Russell Crowe, cinematography Darius Wolski, edited by Tom Eagles, music by Brian Tyler, production companies Bluestone Entertainment, distributed by Sony Pictures Classics, release date September 7, 2025. Running time 148 minutes. Country United States. Languages English. Budget $40 million. Box office $70.5 million.